On a humid morning in Savannah in 1847, the auction yard filled with the low murmur of silk dresses, parasols, and whispered judgments. This was no ordinary slave sale. As the gavel rose, eyes did not turn toward fields or ledgers but toward the bodies of young men forced to stand in silence, measured not for strength alone but for beauty. In a society that preached modesty and moral order, white women arrived as eager bidders competing openly for the most striking male slaves, while the men on the platform learned how quickly admiration could become another form of captivity. What unfolded that day exposed a hidden side of the Old South where power, desire, and cruelty met under the polite mask of respectability. Savannah in the mid-19th century was one of the most active slave-trading cities in the American South, its wealth tied directly to cotton, rice, and the steady movement of enslaved bodies through its ports and markets. The city's cobblestone streets, elegant squares, and refined social gatherings gave an impression of civility and culture. But beneath that surface existed an economy that depended on human commodification. Slave markets were not hidden operations conducted in shameful corners. They were central, organized, and socially accepted institutions woven into the daily life of Savannah. Auctions took place near busy commercial districts, often within walking distance of churches, banks, and theaters, reinforcing how normalized slavery had become among the city's white population. These markets served not only plantation owners from Georgia but buyers from across the Deep South. Savannah's coastal location made it a hub where enslaved people were shipped, sold, and redistributed inland. Auction houses advertised sales in local newspapers, listing ages, skills, physical attributes, and temperaments as if describing livestock or furniture. Sale days were events, drawing crowds that included businessmen, traders, curious onlookers, and members of the social elite. Attendance was not considered improper, rather it was seen as participation in the machinery that sustained Southern prosperity. Elite society in Savannah treated slave auctions as extensions of economic life rather than moral dilemmas. Wealthy families relied on enslaved labor to maintain their homes, plantations, and social status. Ownership of slaves was a visible marker of success, and purchasing them at reputable auctions reinforced one's standing within the community. For the upper class, attending auctions could even resemble a social outing, complete with polite conversation, acquaintances greeting one another, and discreet observations exchanged under the guise of business. The suffering of the enslaved was deliberately ignored or rationalized as necessary and inevitable. Social norms in Savannah allowed elite women to be present at auctions without scandal, especially when purchases were framed as household decisions. Mistresses were expected to oversee domestic affairs, which included selecting enslaved people for cooking, cleaning, childcare, or personal service. This expectation blurred the line between economic necessity and personal preference, creating space for women to attend auctions openly. Their presence further legitimized the markets, giving them an air of respectability that masked the violence inherent in the process. The markets themselves were carefully structured to appeal to elite buyers. Enslaved individuals were cleaned, dressed, and displayed in ways meant to maximize their perceived value. Auctioneers used refined language emphasizing obedience, health, and appearance to attract higher bids. Buyers were encouraged to inspect bodies, ask questions, and imagine how a person would fit into their household or plantation. This ritualized process reinforced the idea that slavery was a rational, orderly system rather than an act of ongoing brutality. Savannah's elite justified their participation through law, religion, and tradition. Slavery was protected by state and federal statutes, defended from pulpits, and embedded in generational wealth. Many families inherited enslaved people along with property, normalizing ownership from childhood. By the 1840s, the system had existed long enough that few within elite circles questioned its legitimacy. Auctions were seen not as moral transgressions but as practical transactions required to maintain economic stability. The city's newspapers played a crucial role in reinforcing this mindset. Auction announcements appeared alongside notices for social events, shipping schedules, and luxury goods. There was no attempt to soften the reality for readers. Instead, the casual placement of these advertisements suggested that buying and selling people was as routine as trading cotton or land. For elite society, this normalization removed any sense of urgency or discomfort that might otherwise arise. At the same time, Savannah's social hierarchy depended on strict control of image and reputation. While auctions were public, discussions about desire, abuse, or emotional attachment to enslaved individuals were kept private. The market provided a socially acceptable setting where power could be exercised openly while motivations remained unspoken. This duality allowed elite society to maintain its polished exterior while engaging in practices that contradicted its professed values of honor and virtue. Economic competition among elites also fueled the prominence of slave market. As plantations expanded and households grew more elaborate, demand for enslaved labor increased. Auctions became arenas where wealth was displayed through aggressive bidding and successful acquisition. Winning a bid was not only a financial transaction but a demonstration of status, signaling one's ability to outspend rivals. This competitive atmosphere further entrenched the markets as symbols of power and prestige. For Savannah's elite, slave auctions were inseparable from the city's identity. They underpinned the prosperity that funded grand homes, social clubs, and lavish lifestyles. The markets were accepted, defended, and even quietly celebrated as mechanisms that sustained the social order. Within this environment, the humanity of the enslaved was systematically stripped away, replaced by numbers, descriptions, and price tags, allowing elite society to function comfortably within a system built entirely on coercion and suffering. The presence of white women as active bidders at slave auctions unsettled even some contemporaries because it challenged the carefully maintained public image of feminine modesty in the Antebellum South. Women were expected to embody refinement, moral virtue, and domestic restraint, yet the auction yard was a public space where human beings were inspected, discussed, and priced aloud. In Savannah, however, elite customs allowed certain rules to bend when wealth and status were involved. Women of prominent families were not merely passive observers. They attended with purpose, accompanied by relatives or servants, and their participation was framed as practical involvement in household management, rather than personal interest. Within elite circles, it was considered appropriate for a mistress to select enslaved people who would work inside her home. Domestic slaves were viewed as extensions of the household, and choosing them was seen as a responsibility that required a woman's judgment. This justification allowed white women to appear at auctions without damaging their reputations. Their bids were often placed calmly, sometimes through male intermediaries, sometimes directly, signaling confidence and authority. The act of bidding itself became a socially sanctioned expression of power, even as it contradicted ideals of female delicacy. The visibility of women at these auctions also served a symbolic function. Their presence softened the brutal image of the market, giving it an air of respectability. A crowd that included well-dressed ladies suggested order, propriety, and moral legitimacy. Auctioneers understood this dynamic and rarely discouraged female attendance. In fact, their participation reassured other buyers that the event was acceptable within polite society. The suffering of enslaved men was obscured by this performance of civility, making the transaction appear less violent and more routine. For many women, attending auctions was also a social experience. Savannah's elite moved within tight social networks, and auction days provided opportunities to see acquaintances, exchange news, and observe rivals. Women evaluated not only the enslaved individuals on the platform but also one another, noting who bid confidently, who hesitated, and who secured desirable purchases. This social dimension transformed auctions into arenas of subtle competition, where taste, wealth, and influence were quietly displayed. The act of bidding allowed white women to exercise economic power rarely acknowledged in public discourse. While laws limited women's legal independence, elite wives often controlled household decisions and influenced large purchases. Through auctions, they directly shaped the composition of their households and asserted authority over enslaved bodies. This power was rarely questioned because it reinforced rather than threatened the existing social hierarchy. Women's participation did not undermine patriarchy, it operated comfortably within it. Yet the presence of women also introduced a different kind of scrutiny. Enslaved men were aware that they were being evaluated not only for labor but for appearance, demeanor, and perceived obedience. When women bidders focused on youth, physical attractiveness, or bearing, it exposed a layer of desire that Southern society refused to acknowledge openly. Publicly, bids were justified through vague references to health or suitability. Privately, motivations could be far more complex, shaped by curiosity, control, and unspoken fascination. Observers sometimes expressed discomfort, though rarely openly. Newspaper accounts avoided mentioning women's bids directly, preferring neutral language that masked gendered dynamics. When criticism did surface, it often framed female bidders as dutiful mistresses, rather than willing participants in exploitation. This selective silence protected women's reputations while maintaining the fiction that slavery was a purely economic institution devoid of personal motives. Women's participation also affected how auctions were conducted. Auctioneers adjusted their tone, avoiding overtly crude language when women were present. Enslaved men were encouraged to appear compliant and restrained, reinforcing ideals of control and submission. This careful staging created an illusion of consent and order. Even as fear and humiliation permeated the platform, the market adapted itself to the sensibilities of elite women, further embedding their influence into the system. The presence of white women as bidders highlighted contradictions at the heart of Southern society. Women were denied political power and legal autonomy, yet they wielded absolute authority over enslaved people. Their moral influence was praised, yet they participated in transactions that destroyed families and stripped men of dignity. These contradictions were rarely addressed because acknowledging them would have required questioning the foundations of slavery itself. For enslaved men, being bid on by women added another layer of vulnerability. The gaze of a female bidder carried different implications than that of a planter seeking labor. It introduced uncertainty, anxiety, and the awareness that their bodies were subject to judgments they could neither predict nor resist. The auction yard became a space where gendered power operated alongside racial domination, reinforcing the total lack of agency experienced by the enslaved. By appearing at auctions, white women helped normalize a system that depended on violence while presenting itself as orderly and refined. Their participation blurred the boundary between domestic virtue and public cruelty, allowing slavery to persist behind a facade of gentility. In Savannah, this visibility was not an anomaly, but a reflection of how deeply slavery had infiltrated every aspect of elite life, shaping behavior, social norms, and the roles women were permitted to play within a society built on ownership and control. In the Savannah auction, beauty was not an abstract or accidental quality, but a measurable asset, carefully converted into monetary value. Enslaved men were no longer assessed solely by their capacity for labor, endurance, or skill, but by how closely their appearance aligned with the aesthetic preferences of white buyers. Skin tone, facial symmetry, posture, height, and youth were openly scrutinized, transforming physical attractiveness into a market advantage. This process reduced beauty to a trait that could be priced, competed for, and owned, reinforcing the idea that even the most personal aspects of a human being could be stripped of meaning and turned into profit. Auctioneers played a critical role in this transformation. Their language elevated physical appearance into selling points, using polished phrases to draw attention to clear eyes, straight limbs, smooth skin, or an agreeable expression. These descriptions were delivered with practiced neutrality, disguising desire and control as objective evaluation. Beauty became a justification for higher bids, framed as evidence of health, refinement, or superior breeding, allowing buyers to rationalize inflated prices without acknowledging the deeper motivations driving demand. The staging of the auction reinforced this commodification. Enslaved men were washed, groomed, and dressed in ways meant to enhance visual appeal. Their bodies were displayed under good light, sometimes made to turn, walk, or stand still, so bidders could fully inspect. This presentation mirrored the display of goods in upscale shops, encouraging buyers to compare, rank, and choose. The men themselves were expected to remain silent and compliant, their lack of resistance interpreted as further proof of suitability. Beauty as a commodity also introduced competition that went beyond economic necessity. Bidding wars erupted not because a plantation required more labor, but because a particular individual was deemed exceptional. Winning such a bid conferred social prestige, signaling refined taste and financial power. The purchase of a beautiful enslaved man became a status symbol, discussed indirectly within elite circles as evidence of discernment and wealth. This emphasis on beauty distorted the already brutal logic of slavery. Value became detached from productivity and tied instead to appearance, creating a hierarchy among the enslaved that mirrored white social structure. Those labeled attractive commanded higher prices while others were dismissed or overlooked. This internal ranking deepened divisions and fostered resentment, as survival and relative privilege became linked to physical traits beyond anyone's control. The commodification of beauty also carried psychological consequences. Enslaved men were acutely aware that their bodies were being judged in ways that had nothing to do with their abilities or character. The gaze of bidders reduced them to surfaces, teaching them that admiration was another form of domination. Beauty did not offer protection. It increased vulnerability by attracting attention and expectations they could neither refuse nor escape. White society justified this process by cloaking it in economic language. Beauty was equated with value and value was equated with price. By framing appearance as an asset, buyers avoided confronting the moral implications of their choice. Desire was recast as preference, exploitation as investment. This rhetorical shift allowed participants to maintain a sense of propriety while engaging in deeply dehumanizing practices. Gender dynamics further complicated the commodification of beauty. When women participated as bidders, the evaluation of male appearance took on additional layers of meaning. Publicly, bids were justified through claims of suitability for domestic service or personal attendance. Privately, beauty blurred boundaries between ownership and desire. The auction provided a socially acceptable venue where such evaluations could occur without explicit acknowledgement, embedding them within the language of commerce. The market rewarded those who embodied ideals shaped by white imagination rather than reality. Features associated with youth and softness were often prized over signs of strength,
reflecting preferences that had little to do with labor and much to do with control. A beautiful enslaved man was expected to be compliant, decorative and easily dominated, reinforcing fantasies of power that extended beyond the auction yard into private spaces. This valuation of beauty exposed contradictions within Southern ideology. Enslaved people were portrayed as inferior and uncivilized, yet their attractiveness was actively sought and monetized. White buyers resolved this contradiction by separating body from personhood. Beauty was acknowledged and desired, but the humanity behind it was denied. The body became an object whose appeal could be enjoyed without moral consequence. Newspaper advertisements and whispered reputations amplified this dynamic. Certain auction houses became known for offering particularly fine individuals, drawing elite crowds eager to acquire rare commodities. Beauty gained a reputation-based value influenced by rumor and anticipation. The enslaved individuals themselves had no control over these narratives, yet their lives were reshaped by them. Over time, the market's fixation on beauty reinforced patterns of abuse and exploitation. Those deemed attractive were more likely to be isolated from others, assigned roles that increased surveillance and dependency. Their appearance became a source of constant scrutiny, with any perceived decline treated as loss of value. Beauty, once commodified, became a burden that demanded maintenance and submission. The auction transformed the human form into a spectacle where admiration and cruelty coexisted seamlessly. Applause for a high bid echoed alongside silent terror, revealing how easily aesthetic appreciation could mask violence. In Savannah's elite society, beauty functioned as currency, social signal and justification, embedding itself into the economic logic of slavery so completely that it appeared natural, inevitable, and even refined, while stripping those on the platform of autonomy, privacy, and identity.
At slave auctions in Savannah, the assessment of enslaved men extended far beyond measurements of muscle endurance or agricultural skill. Buyers examined qualities that could not be easily quantified yet were treated as equally important to market value. Temperament, demeanor, posture, speech, and perceived obedience became crucial criteria shaping bids as much as physical capability. This expanded evaluation reflected a shift in how enslaved men were imagined within elite households, where control, appearance, and personal service mattered as much as productivity. Auctioneers encouraged this broader scrutiny by inviting buyers to observe how an individual carried himself. A calm expression, lowered eyes, and controlled movements were interpreted as signs of discipline and submission. Any hint of defiance or anxiety could lower perceived value regardless of physical strength. Enslaved men learned quickly that survival depended not only on their bodies but on their ability to perform compliance under extreme pressure. This performance was not optional. It was demanded by a system that rendered silence and punished visible fear. Speech patterns and voice were also evaluated. Men who spoke softly, answered questions politely, or remained quiet altogether were often favored over those who hesitated or spoke too freely. Language became a marker of control, with accents, vocabulary, and tone scrutinized for signs of intelligence or perceived insolence. Buyers projected assumptions onto these traits, believing they revealed character, loyalty, or future behavior, even though such judgments were rooted in prejudice rather than reality. Age was another factor weighed alongside strength. Youth was prized not only for physical potential but for malleability. Younger men were considered easier to train, discipline, and reshape according to an owner's expectations. Their perceived adaptability increased their value, while older men were often dismissed as stubborn or resistant. This emphasis on youth reinforced the idea that enslaved men were raw material to be molded rather than individuals with established identities. Appearance beyond muscle mattered deeply. Cleanliness, grooming, and facial expression were treated as indicators of worth. Men who appeared well-kept were assumed to be healthier, more obedient, and more suitable for close proximity to white households. These assumptions ignored the reality that presentation was controlled by traders who prepared individuals specifically to appeal to buyers. The illusion of natural refinement masked the coercion behind it. Buyers also evaluated emotional resentment. Enslaved men who showed grief, anger, or desperation risked being labeled problematic. Emotional suppression became a survival strategy, though it came at immense psychological cost. The auction platform demanded not only physical exposure but emotional erasure, forcing men to conceal their humanity in order to be deemed valuable. Skills unrelated to field labor were given special attention. Literacy, musical ability, or experience in domestic service could raise prices dramatically. These skills suggested usefulness in elite environments, where enslaved men might serve as attendants, drivers, or personal servants. Such roles required constant visibility and compliance, making demeanor and adaptability as important as strength. The market rewarded those who appeared capable of navigating these spaces without disrupting white comfort. Health assessments extended beyond obvious injury. Buyers searched for signs of chronic illness, scars or exhaustion, often conducting invasive inspections. At the same time, they looked for vitality expressed through posture and eye contact. This contradiction revealed how health was understood less as well-being and more as sustained utility. A man's body was judged for how long it could be exploited rather than how it had endured past suffering. The evaluation process also reflected fantasies held by buyers. Enslaved men were imagined in future roles shaped by white desires rather than practical need. A man's bearing might inspire assumptions about loyalty or devotion, while his silence could be misread as contentment. These projections transformed individuals into imagined characters, reducing their lives to narratives that justified ownership. Social reputation played a role as well. Traders sometimes whispered endorsements or warnings, shaping bids through suggestion rather than evidence. A man labeled as good-natured or manageable could command higher prices, while rumors of resistance or escape attempts reduced interest. These reputations often followed individuals without their knowledge, influencing outcomes they could not control. This layered evaluation reinforced hierarchies within the enslaved population. Men deemed suitable for elite service were separated from others, creating divisions that benefited owners by preventing solidarity. Value became associated with proximity to whiteness, politeness, and invisibility rather than strength or resilience. The system rewarded those who could best erase themselves. Beyond strength, the auction assessed a man's perceived willingness to disappear into another's life. Obedience, silence, adaptability and aesthetic appeal combined to form an ideal that served elite comfort and control. This ideal had little to do with reality and everything to do with maintaining dominance. The auction thus became a stage where enslaved men were forced to present not only their bodies but a version of themselves, shaped entirely by white expectation, judged by criteria designed to strip away agency while preserving the illusion of order and refinement. Power in the Antebellum South was not only enforced through laws and violence, but expressed through everyday rituals that reinforced who commanded and who submitted. The slave auction was one of the clearest stages on which this power was performed. Buyers stood freely, spoke openly and decided fates with a raised hand or a nod, while enslaved men were compelled to stand still, silent and exposed. This imbalance was not accidental. It was carefully maintained to remind everyone present where authority resided. Control was exercised not only through ownership, but through the public demonstration of dominance over another human being. Desire operated within this structure of power in ways that Southern society refused to name openly. Officially, auctions were economic transactions, governed by necessity and practicality. Unofficially, they were spaces where fascination, curiosity, and attraction could be acted upon under the protection of legality. Desire was sanitized by language, disguised as preference or suitability, allowing participants to indulge impulses without acknowledging them. This denial made desire more insidious, because it functioned without accountability, hidden behind the mask of commerce. Control depended on this denial. By refusing to name desire, white society preserved the illusion of moral superiority. Enslaved men were portrayed as property, not as objects of interest or attraction, even when their bodies were scrutinized with intense attention. This contradiction allowed buyers to look without guilt, to choose without reflection, and to claim righteousness while exercising total authority. Power thrived in this space between what was done and what was admitted. For enslaved men, this dynamic created constant uncertainty. They were subject not only to physical domination but to unpredictable expectations shaped by the desires of others. A glance, a gesture or rumor could alter their fate. Control extended into the smallest details of behavior, forcing men to regulate their expressions, movements, and even emotion. Survival required learning how to exist under the gaze of power without provoking it, a task made more difficult when that gaze was charged with unspoken intention. The auction yard revealed how power and desire reinforced each other. The ability to choose was itself a form of pleasure for buyers, a reminder of their absolute authority. Selecting one person over another, raising a bid, outcompeting rivals, all affirmed dominance. Desire did not weaken power, it intensified it by adding personal investment to structural control. Ownership became not only legal but intimate, binding authority to individual will. Gender added another layer to this relationship. When women participated as buyers or observers, power took on a different texture without losing its force. Women were constrained by social norms, yet within the system of slavery they wielded unchecked authority over enslaved men. This paradox allowed them to exercise control while maintaining an image of refinement. Desire, when present, was even more carefully concealed, protected by assumptions of female virtue. The system accommodated this by providing silence, discretion, and denial. Control was also exercised through anticipation. Enslaved men were forced to imagine futures they could not shape,
owned by people whose intentions were unknown. This uncertainty was itself a mechanism of domination. Power did not need to announce its plans. It only needed to remain unpredictable. Desire heightened this unpredictability, introducing possibilities that were never spoken but always felt. The language used in auctions further revealed how power framed desire. Words like temperament, disposition, and suitability replaced more honest descriptions of interest or attraction. These terms transformed subjective impulses into objective criteria, allowing control to appear rational. Desire was translated into value, and value into price, completing the cycle that made exploitation seem orderly and justified. Violence underpinned all of this, even when it was not visible. The knowledge that punishment awaited resistance gave power its edge. Desire could be indulged precisely because force stood ready to enforce compliance. This threat did not need to be stated. It was understood by everyone present. Control was maintained through the memory of violence as much as through its immediate application. The system also relied on fragmentation, by isolating enslaved men from one another, assigning them different values and subjecting them to individualized scrutiny. Power prevented collective resistance. Desire contributed to this fragmentation by singling out certain individuals for special attention. Being chosen did not mean safety. It often meant deeper vulnerability. Control adapted itself to each case, ensuring that no one escaped its reach. Within elite society, these dynamics were rarely discussed openly. Silence protected reputations and preserved the fiction that slavery was impersonal. Power depended on this silence to function smoothly. By refusing to acknowledge desire, society avoided confronting the intimacy of its own cruelty. Control remained abstract, expressed through laws and customs rather than personal accountability. Yet the auction made this abstraction impossible for those on the platform. Enslaved men experienced power directly, as hands inspected them, eyes assessed them, and voices debated their worth. Desire, though unnamed, was felt in the intensity of attention and the narrowing of choices. Control was complete, not because it was always brutal, but because it was total, extending into body, future and identity. The intersection of power, desire and control exposed the emotional architecture of slavery. It was not sustained by economics alone but by the ability of one group to impose meaning, silence and expectation onto another. The auction yard concentrated these forces into a single moment, revealing how domination could be exercised politely, efficiently, and without open cruelty, while still stripping men of agency, dignity and self-determination under the guise of lawful exchange. Southern society in the mid-19th century rested on a carefully constructed image of honor, morality and Christian virtue. Planters and urban elites spoke proudly of refinement, hospitality and family values, presenting themselves as guardians of civilization in a supposedly wild world. Churches preached order and obedience, newspapers praised benevolence and paternal care, and social rituals emphasized restraint and propriety. Yet beneath this polished exterior existed practices that directly contradicted these ideals. And nowhere was this contradiction more visible than in the slave market. The same people who defended their moral standing participated openly in transactions that relied on humiliation, coercion, and the destruction of human lives. Respectability in the South was not defined by compassion but by conformity to social norms. As long as behavior aligned with accepted customs, its moral implications were rarely questioned. Slave auctions fit neatly into this framework. They were legal, public, and regulated, allowing participants to claim legitimacy regardless of the suffering involved. The presence of well-dressed buyers, orderly bidding and formal language gave the illusion of civility, masking the violence inherent in the act of selling people. This performance of order reassured society that nothing improper was taking place. Hypocrisy thrived in the separation between public virtue and private action. Southern elites spoke passionately about protecting women, preserving decency and maintaining moral boundaries. Yet they condoned and benefited from a system that exposed enslaved men and women to constant vulnerability. Sexual exploitation, family separation and physical punishment were widely known realities, but they were treated as unfortunate side effects rather than moral failures. By refusing to confront these contradictions, society preserved its self-image while continuing its abuses. Religion played a central role in sustaining this hypocrisy. Biblical passages were selectively interpreted to justify slavery, framing it as part of a divinely ordained order. Ministers preached obedience to masters while avoiding discussions of justice or equality. This selective morality allowed slaveholders to see themselves as righteous, even benevolent, while participating in practices that violated the very principles of compassion and humility their faith claimed to uphold. The auction yard existed comfortably alongside the church pew, each reinforcing the other's authority. Gender norms further exposed the duplicity of Southern respectability. Women were idealized as symbols of purity and moral guidance, yet they lived within households sustained by exploitation. Their refined lifestyles depended on the unpaid labor and suffering of enslaved people. When women appeared at auctions, this contradiction became impossible to ignore. Their participation challenged the narrative of female innocence, yet society resolved the tension by redefining exploitation as domestic management. Hypocrisy adjusted itself to preserve appearances. Language was one of the most powerful tools used to maintain this divide. Brutal realities were softened through euphemism. Enslaved people were described as hands, servants, or property, stripping away their humanity. Violence became discipline, separation became sale, and desire became preference. This linguistic transformation allowed individuals to discuss cruelty without acknowledging it, preserving a sense of moral distance. Words shielded consciences while enabling harm. Public silence was equally important. Certain topics were simply not discussed in polite company. Abuse, coercion, and exploitation were understood but rarely spoken aloud. This collective silence created a shared understanding that some truths were inconvenient and therefore unnecessary. Respectability depended on knowing what not to say. Those who broke this silence risked social exclusion, reinforcing conformity and discouraging moral challenge. The economic foundations of Southern society made hypocrisy profitable. Wealth generated by enslaved labor funded education, architecture, fashion, and leisure. Acknowledging the immorality of slavery would have threatened not only social status but financial security. Hypocrisy became a survival strategy for the elite, allowing them to enjoy the benefits of exploitation while denying responsibility for its cost. Moral discomfort was outweighed by material gain. Social rituals reinforced this denial. Balls, dinners, and public ceremonies celebrated refinement and order, diverting attention from the violence that sustained them. Enslaved people were expected to facilitate these events invisibly, their labor erased from the narrative of elegance. The contrast between polished social life and brutal labor conditions was stark, yet rarely acknowledged. Hypocrisy was woven into daily life, normalized through repetition. The legal system further entrenched this contradiction. Laws protected property rights over human rights, granting legitimacy to practices that would otherwise be indefensible. Courts enforced contracts involving human beings, while denying enslaved people any legal person. This legal framework allowed society to claim order and justice while institutionalizing injustice. Respectability was grounded in legality, not morality. Education and upbringing ensured that hypocrisy was passed down through generations. Children in elite families grew up witnessing auctions, punishments, and household exploitation, learning to accept them as normal. Moral lessons focused on obedience and honor rather than empathy. By the time these children reached adulthood, contradictions no longer appeared contradictory. They were simply part of the world as it was. The slave auction stood as a public contradiction that Southern society learned to ignore. It exposed the gap between professed values and lived reality, yet was absorbed into the fabric of respectability. Polite manners coexisted with cruelty, religious devotion with exploitation, and moral rhetoric with systemic abuse. This coexistence was not accidental but essential, allowing the South to sustain a system that depended on denying its own inhumanity while presenting itself as cultured, honorable, and righteous.
Public slave auctions inflicted psychological harm that extended far beyond the moment of sale, shaping how enslaved men understood themselves, their bodies, and their place in the world. Being forced onto a platform in front of strangers stripped away privacy and dignity in an instant. Every glance, whisper, and gesture communicated a single message. Their inner lives were irrelevant, and their value existed only in how others judged them. This experience was not a temporary humiliation, but a foundational trauma that followed many men throughout their lives. The loss of control was immediate and absolute. Enslaved men were compelled to stand, move, speak, or remain silent on command, their bodies treated as objects for inspection. This forced obedience created a deep sense of powerlessness. Decisions that would determine separation from family, location, labor, and survival were made without their input. The awareness that one's future could be altered by a stranger's whim eroded any sense of personal agency, replacing it with constant vigilance and fear. Public exposure intensified this trauma. Shame was not a private feeling but a spectacle. Being examined physically, discussed openly, and compared to others fostered an internalized sense of inferiority. Many men learned to dissociate, mentally distancing themselves from their bodies to endure the scrutiny. This coping mechanism offered temporary relief, but often resulted in long-term emotional numbness, making it difficult to form attachments or trust others. The uncertainty of the auction amplified psychological stress. Not knowing who would purchase them or what awaited afterward created a state of chronic anxiety. Rumors circulated among the enslaved about cruel masters, sexual exploitation, or brutal labor conditions, and the auction transformed these fears into immediate possibilities. Every bid narrowed or expanded imagined futures, forcing men to anticipate suffering without the ability to prepare or resist. Family separation was one of the most devastating aspects of the auction experience. Enslaved men often stood knowing that wives, children, parents, or siblings might be sold moments before or after them. The inability to intervene or even speak intensified feelings of helplessness and guilt. Many carried lifelong grief for family members lost in this way, compounded by the knowledge that their own bodies had been the currency that enabled such separation, even though they bore no responsibility for it. The act of being evaluated psychologically reshaped self-perception. Men were judged not only for physical traits but for demeanor and compliance, teaching them that survival depended on suppressing emotions. Fear, anger, and despair had to be hidden, replaced with a controlled exterior that buyers interpreted as obedient. Over time, this performance could blur into identity, making it difficult to recognize one's authentic feelings or express them safely. The gaze of buyers carried particular weight. Being looked at with interest, indifference, or contempt communicated different threats. Interest could mean isolation or exploitation, while indifference suggested disposability. This constant assessment trained enslaved men to read subtle cues obsessively, a psychological burden that persisted long after the auction. Hyper-awareness became a survival skill, but it also entrenched anxiety and mistrust. Competition among bidders added another layer of distress. High bids signaled desirability, but this did not translate into safety. Instead, it often meant heightened expectations and surveillance. Low bids or lack of interest, on the other hand, suggested rejection and devaluation. Either outcome reinforced the idea that worth was externally defined and unstable, dependent on forces beyond one's control. The presence of onlookers, including women and children, deepened the sense of dehumanization. Knowing that one's humiliation was witnessed by those considered morally upright reinforced the belief that society as a whole accepted this treatment. This realization eroded hope for justice or recognition, replacing it with resignation. The auction became evidence that cruelty was not an exception but a social norm. Memory played a powerful role in sustaining psychological harm. The sights, sounds, and smells of the auction yard embedded themselves deeply, resurfacing in moments of stress or vulnerability. Formerly enslaved men later described these memories as intrusive and uncontrollable, disrupting sleep and concentration. Trauma was not confined to the past. It intruded repeatedly into the present, shaping behavior and emotional responses. The auction also disrupted communal bonds among enslaved men. Forced comparison and ranking undermined solidarity, encouraging internalized competition. Men learned that another's loss might mean their own survival, a realization that produced guilt and moral conflict. This fragmentation served the system by weakening collective resistance, but it left lasting emotional scars marked by isolation and self-blame. Over time, repeated exposure to such experiences normalized psychological injury. Pain became expected, and endurance became a measure of worth. Enslaved men learned to endure humiliation silently, a skill that ensured survival but exacted a heavy cost. Emotional suppression limited the ability to grieve openly, seek comfort, or imagine alternatives, reinforcing a cycle of trauma that extended beyond the auction yard into every aspect of life. The psychological impact of public auctions was therefore not incidental but central to the institution of slavery. By attacking identity, agency, and emotional integrity, the auction ensured compliance long after the gavel fell. The damage did not end with purchase. It shaped how enslaved men navigated relationships, authority, and selfhood, embedding fear and uncertainty into the fabric of daily existence under a system designed to dominate not only bodies but minds. The legal framework of slavery created a sharp divide between what was formally acknowledged and what was privately understood. By law, enslaved people were property, defined in contracts, bills of sale, and court records as commodities that could be bought, sold, inherited, or seized. This legal status reduced human beings to objects, granting owners absolute authority over bodies, labor, and movement. Within this framework, ownership was presented as neutral and impersonal, a matter of rights and transactions rather than relationships. Yet beneath this legal clarity existed motives and intentions that could not be written into law, shaping behavior in ways that were widely understood but rarely spoken aloud. The law provided cover. By framing slavery as ownership, it removed the need to explain why a particular individual was desired or chosen. A buyer did not need to justify interest beyond stating that a purchase was lawful. This shield allowed private motives to remain invisible, protected by legality. Courts enforced ownership without questioning intention, and contracts recorded prices without recording reasons. The absence of scrutiny made the system flexible enough to accommodate motives that contradicted public values. Private motives often shaped decisions far more than legal necessity. Buyers told themselves and others that they were acquiring labor, yet choices frequently reflected personal preference. Appearance, demeanor, youth, and perceived obedience influenced bids as much as practical skill. These preferences were rarely acknowledged because acknowledging them would have exposed the gap between the official purpose of slavery and its lived reality. Silence preserved respectability while allowing desire, curiosity, and control to operate freely. This separation between law and motive was reinforced by social etiquette. In polite society, one did not discuss the reasons behind acquiring a particular enslaved person. Questions were deflected with references to suitability or need. Gossip might circulate quietly, but it rarely crossed into public acknowledgement. The shared understanding was that certain truths existed but were not to be articulated. This unspoken agreement allowed society to function without confronting its own contradiction. The legal language of ownership stripped enslaved people of personhood, but private interactions constantly contradicted this abstraction. Owners observed emotions, formed attachments, and reacted to resistance or compliance. These interactions revealed an awareness of humanity that the law denied. Rather than resolving this contradiction, slaveholding society managed it by compartmentalization. Publicly enslaved people were property. Privately they were recognized as individuals, but only in ways that served the owner's interests. This compartmentalization allowed for selective morality. An owner could consider himself honorable while engaging in behavior that violated his own stated value. The law did not require him to explain how he treated those he owned, only that he owned them. Accountability ended at legality. Everything beyond that boundary existed in a moral vacuum where private motives could flourish unchecked. The auction intensified this divide. Publicly it was a legal exchange. Privately it was a moment of intense judgment and anticipation. Buyers evaluated individuals not only for labor, but for imagined futures shaped by personal desire. These imaginings remained internal, shielded by the neutrality of the transaction. The gavel transformed intention into ownership without ever naming what had driven the bid. For enslaved men, this gap created profound insecurity. They were subject to rules that treated them as objects, yet they experienced treatment that revealed personal interest. This contradiction made it impossible to predict behavior. A man could be disciplined harshly one moment and treated with familiarity the next, without explanation. The law offered no protection against this unpredictability because it recognized only ownership, not abuse or motive. Private motives also shaped how enslaved men were used after purchase. Assignments to domestic service, personal attendance, or isolation often reflected unspoken intentions rather than practical need. These decisions were justified publicly as management choices, yet their true motivations remained concealed. The law did not inquire into how or why an owner exercised his rights, only that he possessed them. The silence surrounding motive protected not only individuals but the system itself. By refusing to name desire, exploitation, or abuse, society avoided creating language that might challenge legality. What remained unnamed could not be regulated or condemned. The law's simplicity became its strength, enabling complexity beneath the surface without accountability. This divide also shaped historical records. Documents preserve prices, ages, and locations, but rarely intentions or experiences. The archive reflects legality, not reality. As a result, much of what drove behavior must be inferred rather than read direct. The absence of explicit motive in records is not accidental but structural, a product of a system designed to obscure its own workings. Within elite society, understanding this gap was a form of social literacy. Knowing what could be said and what must remain unsaid signaled belonging. Those who violated this boundary risked scandal, not because they had done wrong, but because they had named what others preferred to keep hidden. Silence functioned as protection. The contradiction between legal ownership and private motive reveals the emotional core of slavery. It was not sustained by law alone, but by the ability to deny complexity. The law flattened human relationships into transactions, while private life exploited the depth that this flattening denied. This tension allowed slavery to adapt, absorbing individual impulses without ever acknowledging them publicly. In Savannah and elsewhere, the auction stood at the intersection of these forces. It was the moment where legality and motive met without colliding, where a raised hand could translate unspoken intention into recognized ownership. The system depended on this seamless conversion, transforming private desire into public right without ever requiring explanation, and preserving a structure where what mattered most was never officially named. The public silence and private scandal surrounding slave auctions in the Antebellum South reflected a society deeply invested in appearances, where what was spoken aloud rarely matched the reality of human experience. Auctions were public events,
attended by hundreds of spectators, advertised in newspapers, and conducted with procedural formality. The visibility of the sale was essential for maintaining the perception of legality, order and propriety. Yet beneath this public display, existed layers of unspoken knowledge, desire and impropriety that everyone understood but few acknowledged, creating a tension between the visible and the invisible, the declared and the felt. Spectatorship itself was a social performance. White buyers, particularly men, moved through the auction yard with confidence, examining, comparing and bidding as if their actions were guided solely by rational economic consideration. Women attended in accordance with social expectations of domestic oversight, observing and occasionally bidding for household purposes. Outsiders might have assumed that the event was a neutral transaction, a market for labor. In reality, the act of witnessing carried layers of implication. The gaze of those in attendance communicated approval, expectation and evaluation. Every choice made by buyers was scrutinized by their peers, and the audience absorbed subtleties that never made it into print. At the same time, the public nature of auctions made them sites of potential scandal, though scandal was carefully contained. The intense evaluation of enslaved men for qualities beyond labor, appearance, comportment, youth, and perceived temperament was understood to carry erotic undertones. This awareness generated gossip and speculation, yet open discussion risked social censure. The very desire that motivated some bids was acceptable only when left unspoken. Thus the auction functioned as both a literal and figurative stage for the projection of private impulses, under the guise of economic necessity. The private scandals that emerged from auctions often involved the interaction of power, gender and attraction. Enslaved men could be singled out for attention in ways that blurred the lines between ownership and personal desire. Buyers might justify selection based on health, obedience or potential for domestic service, yet private motives often diverged from these explanations. Such actions could provoke jealousy, rivalry or gossip among the elite, particularly when high bids were placed in competitive fashion. Reputation became a currency alongside money, and the ability to maintain social respect while participating in morally ambiguous acts was essential to sustaining one's standing. The enslaved men themselves were acutely aware of these dynamics. They understood that the public silence was a mask covering unspoken truths about who valued them and why. Their bodies were under constant scrutiny, and every movement or expression could be interpreted as either submission or defiance. The tension between what was observable and what was hidden intensified psychological pressure, forcing men to navigate an environment where survival depended on reading invisible signals and anticipating the unspoken rules of propriety. Auctioneers also contributed to this delicate balance. Their language was deliberately neutral, emphasizing practical attributes, while avoiding acknowledgement of socially sensitive motives. Phrases like good disposition or agreeable temperament served as coded language that allowed buyers to communicate interest without breaching decorum. The auctioneer's skill lay in maintaining this veneer of legality and respectability, while managing an event charged with private tension. Missteps could lead to embarrassment, complaints or damage to the auction house's reputation. The media played a complementary role. Newspapers advertised sales with lists of ages, skills and qualities, yet deliberately avoided commentary that might expose the underlying human drama. Descriptions focused on utility rather than individuality, on categories rather than people. The omission of emotional or erotic subtext allowed society to read auctions as ordinary transactions, preserving public comfort while leaving private understanding intact. This selective reporting reinforced social norms and ensured that scandal remained contained within whispered circles. Despite these safeguards, rumors and informal discussion circulated widely. Families, neighbors and acquaintances often exchanged stories about which individuals were considered especially desirable, who had attracted competition, or who had been purchased for reasons that extended beyond labor. These narratives existed in tension with the formal accounts, creating a parallel system of knowledge, accessible only to those willing to read between the lines. The duality of public silence and private awareness allowed a kind of unspoken accountability. Everyone knew what had happened, yet no one could admit it openly. This tension also reinforced the social hierarchy. Elite buyers and sellers could indulge private motives with little risk of consequence, while enslaved men had no voice in the process and no legal or social recourse. The very mechanisms that enabled scandal, the secrecy of desire, the discretion surrounding judgment, served to reinforce power. Those who controlled speech and observation could manipulate perception, ensuring that the social order remained intact. In this sense, silence was both protective for the powerful and destructive for the powerless. The psychological burden on enslaved men was compounded by the interplay of observation, rumor and anticipation. They were not only being sold but evaluated according to criteria that could never be openly stated. Desire, jealousy and reputation shaped their fates in ways invisible to the law but tangible in everyday experience. The ability to navigate these invisible pressures became a matter of survival, yet it imposed profound mental and emotional strain. Every interaction, every glance, every response carried consequences that could not be controlled or predicted. In the broader social context, this duality maintained the illusion of morality and civility. Public silence ensured that Southern society could continue to present itself as refined, orderly and ethical, while private scandal revealed the contradictions embedded in that presentation. Auctions were thus simultaneously spectacles of compliance, exercises in social theater, and conduits for the hidden complexities of desire and control. The gap between what was officially recognized and what was privately acknowledged allowed the system of slavery to function smoothly, while reproducing inequality, coercion and social hierarchy. The combination of public decorum and private intrigue created a distinctive culture surrounding the auction yard. Every participant, buyer, seller, observer and auctioneer understood the rules, speak of utility, observe behavior and maintain appearance. Beneath this regulated behavior, unspoken knowledge governed interactions, shaping choices, bids, and relationships. The coexistence of silence and scandal ensured that power could be exercised with subtlety and efficiency, reinforcing social norms while allowing private motives to flourish unchecked. This dynamic had lasting consequences for all involved. Elite participants learned to navigate moral contradictions, balancing desire, reputation and legality with skill. Enslaved men were forced to internalize lessons of compliance, self-control and awareness of hidden intention. The tension between what could be publicly acknowledged and what was privately understood shaped social interaction, emotional responses and expectations, embedding the psychological effects of surveillance, evaluation and social scrutiny into everyday life. Public silence and private scandal therefore were not incidental features of slave auctions, but central mechanisms that sustained the institution itself. By carefully controlling speech, gaze and narrative, society maintained the appearance of decency while accommodating impulses and actions that contradicted moral rhetoric. This duality allowed auctions to function as both economic events and stages for social power, creating a system in which authority, desire, and propriety intersected in ways that were carefully managed, yet deeply destabilizing for those without control over their own lives.
What this auction reveals about gender and slavery is a complex interplay of power, control, desire and societal expectation that exposes the contradictions at the heart of the antebellum South. Gender roles in this period were rigidly defined in public discourse. Men were the authoritative heads of households responsible for law, order and property, while women were idealized as paragons of morality, domestic caretakers and symbols of refinement. Yet within the slave market, these prescribed roles were both enforced and disrupted. Men wielded overt legal authority through bidding and ownership, but women exercised subtle, equally consequential forms of influence. The auction became a stage on which these roles intersected, producing dynamics that could never be fully articulated in polite society yet shaped daily life profoundly. Elite white women, while constrained by legal and social norms that limited their public power, found avenues of agency within the system of slavery. Attending auctions allowed them to participate in decisions that directly affected household composition. They could select enslaved men for domestic service, for attendance to personal needs, or even for entertainment, all under the socially acceptable guise of household management. This form of influence gave women a measure of authority rarely recognized outside domestic spaces, allowing them to navigate the intersection of gender and power in ways that challenged the assumption that men alone controlled society. Women's choices, though framed as practical, were deeply entwined with personal preference and social signaling, revealing how gendered agency could operate within structures designed to limit it. At the same time, the auction exposed how the bodies of enslaved men were understood as sites where both male and female power could be enacted. Male bidders asserted dominance through financial means, displaying wealth and decision-making authority. Their bids determined not only who would be owned but who would occupy particular roles within labor hierarchies, plantation routines, and private spaces. The gavel became an instrument through which patriarchal authority was exercised publicly, visible to all and reinforced through ritualized gestures of control. The auction thus amplified male power, presenting it as absolute and legitimized by law and custom. However, the presence of women complicated this picture. Female bidders and observers evaluated enslaved men in ways that incorporated aesthetic judgment, temperament and compliance alongside physical capability. Their preferences influenced pricing, placement and future assignments, embedding gendered forms of desire and valuation into a system otherwise governed by economic and legal logic. Women's attention introduced subtleties of attraction and scrutiny that were socially coded as innocuous or domestic, yet carried profound implications for the enslaved. In this sense, gender shaped not only social identity but also the lived experience of slavery, mediating how men were perceived, chosen, and ultimately controlled. The auction also highlighted contradictions between public morality and private interest. Southern society prized female virtue, chastity, and propriety, yet women's evaluation of male slaves for desirability, whether aesthetic, behavioral, or skill-based, introduced a tension between ideals and practice. Publicly, these assessments were framed as necessary for domestic management. Privately, they could reflect personal taste, curiosity, or even desire. This duality exemplified how gendered norms allowed for the expression of private motives under socially sanctioned guises, permitting the exploitation of enslaved men to proceed with minimal scrutiny. Women were able to navigate between compliance with societal expectations and participation in morally ambiguous actions, a contradiction that was both invisible to outsiders and deeply felt by those on the platform. The impact on enslaved men was profound, producing a form of vulnerability shaped by gendered perceptions. Men were subjected to the evaluation not only of other men's authority but of women's judgment, which could determine their roles, treatment, and exposure. Being scrutinized for compliance, appearance, or temperament meant that male bodies were doubly measured, against economic utility and against social ideals of refinement and subservience mediated through female attention. This dual evaluation heightened anxiety and reinforced the perception that selfhood was subordinate to external expectations. Men had no voice in this system, yet were forced to anticipate the desires and judgments of both genders in order to survive. Gender also shaped the social performance required in the auction. Men were trained, through coercion and observation, to present themselves in ways that aligned with both male and female expectations. This included posture, expression, behavior, and restraint, all carefully monitored for indications of obedience or resistance. Compliance became a complex negotiation requiring attentiveness to the subtleties of power expressed differently by men and women. Failure to navigate these expectations could lower one's value, increase vulnerability, or provoke punishment, demonstrating how gendered scrutiny was integral to maintaining control over the enslaved population. Moreover, the auction revealed broader societal attitudes toward the intersection of gender and race. The desire for control over male bodies, mediated through both masculine authority and feminine evaluation, reinforced the racial hierarchy by asserting white dominance in multiple dimensions. Men's legal, physical, and symbolic power was foregrounded, while women's influence operated through subtler channels that nevertheless reinforced the system. Both contributed to the subjugation of enslaved men, demonstrating how gendered practices were entwined with racialized power structure. White supremacy and patriarchal authority were mutually reinforcing, each shaping the other to preserve a social order based on domination and surveillance. This intersection also illuminated the ways in which gender informed concepts of property and value. Male buyers and auctioneers framed worth in terms of utility, obedience, and economic potential, while female participants incorporated considerations of aesthetics, temperament, and perceived suitability for domestic roles. The fusion of these perspectives determined the ultimate price, placement, and function of each enslaved man, reflecting a system in which valuation was never purely economic but always mediated through socially constructed ideas of gendered roles and expectations. Property was gendered, and valuation incorporated the biases and desires associated with both male and female authority. Furthermore, gender shaped the social lessons imparted to those observing or participating in auction. White men learned that their authority required public assertion, strategic competition, and maintenance of social standing. White women learned that influence could be exercised subtly through discretion, observation, and private judgment. Enslaved men learned that survival demanded attentiveness not only to legal and physical domination but also to gendered evaluation, performance, and the negotiation of multiple, sometimes conflicting expectations. These lessons reinforced hierarchies while teaching participants to internalize and reproduce them in ways that sustained the system. Ultimately, the auction demonstrated that slavery was not merely an economic institution but a social and cultural system in which gender played a critical role. Men wielded overt legal and physical power, while women exercised influence through evaluation, selection, and aesthetic judgment. The enslaved were caught between these forces, their lives shaped by the intersecting authority and desires of both genders. Gender-mediated experience, value, and control, revealing the complexity of the system, and the ways in which socially prescribed roles could be manipulated, contested, and exploited within the framework of slavery. The auction in Savannah in 1847, with its intersection of race, gender, power, and desire, stands as a stark testament to the human cost of slavery.
It exposes a society that could publicly celebrate morality, refinement, and propriety while privately sustaining violence, exploitation, and the commodification of human beings. Every element, from the gaze of women bidders to the competitive bids of men, from the grooming of enslaved bodies to the silent negotiation of legality and motive, reveals how slavery was more than labor. It was a system of control that penetrated the mind, the body, and the social fabric itself. The enslaved men who were sold, examined, and valued on superficial traits, endured a trauma that laws could not acknowledge and social norms could not soften. Their lives were reduced to objects of judgment, their futures determined by forces beyond their control, their humanity consistently denied. Yet even in this extreme subjugation, the dynamics of resistance, survival, and self-preservation quietly persist. The auction was not merely a moment of sale, it was a crucible that exposed the full reach of power, legal, social, psychological, and sexual, and the ways in which it was exercised to sustain a system built on domination. By examining this moment closely, we are forced to confront the contradictions at the heart of the antebellum South, the tension between public virtue and private vice, between law and desire, between social expectation and individual suffering. The Savannah auction, with its combination of spectacle, secrecy, and violence, becomes more than history. It is a mirror reflecting the mechanisms by which oppression becomes normalized, how inequality is perpetuated, and how humanity can be both denied and asserted under unimaginable pressure. It leaves a lasting lesson that power is most dangerous when it operates not only through force but through social structures, cultural norms, and the unspoken rules of observation and judgment. The lives of the enslaved, the choices of buyers, and the performances of both men and women on the auction block reveal a world where morality was negotiable, virtue was performative, and human dignity was subordinate to wealth and status. Remembering these realities is not only an acknowledgement of history but a call to recognize the ways in which systems of power can dehumanize, invisibilize, and exploit, lessons that remain urgent long after the gavel has fallen. The Savannah auction is therefore not just a moment frozen in time, it is a lens through which we can understand the broader architecture of oppression, the fragility of freedom, and the enduring courage of those who survived. It challenges us to reckon with the full weight of human suffering inflicted in the name of profit, propriety, and power, and to ensure that such systems are neither forgotten nor repeated.